This year, an Estonian court delivered a guilty verdict against 2 deputies, establishing the fact of their cooperation with representatives of Russian intelligence. Their goal was to form illegal civil self-defense units that, in a political vacuum, would take on army functions. And now imagine that, for example, after the scheduled presidential elections in 2026 in Estonia, during protests organized by such self-defense units, an unknown sniper opens fire on the protesters. And Moscow, accusing Tallinn of shooting peaceful citizens, sends a limited military contingent into the Baltic Republic to take control of the situation. It's an unlikely scenario, but we're not really debating Putin's pretext for a new special military operation. Rather, we're considering how European NATO would respond. And so let's still assume that it has begun. European countries are mobilizing their troops and starting to move forces to the east. And here, the first problem isn't the Ku-101 cruise missiles, not the Iskanders or hypersonic daggers, but European bureaucracy. For a military convoy to cross European borders, it requires dozens of permits from civilian agencies, transport regulators, customs, local administrations, and infrastructure operators, not just a headquarters decision. The Swedish Defense Research Agency notes this in its report. Experts point out NATO's critical problems in logistics, and some of them are simply due to paperwork. For example, in 2023, a convoy transporting Paladin howitzers for the Cyber Junction Alliance exercise was delayed in Germany due to incorrectly filled out documents that lacked a permit for highway movement. Usually, this is only allowed from 9 post-meridium to 5 ante-meridium to avoid disturbing citizens during the day. The howitzers were delayed for days due to document reapproval. In other CyberGuard exercises, an unnamed NATO country banned tank transport by road since the pavement couldn't support heavy loads. Another alliance exercise faced the issue that some of the transportation is carried out by private carriers and military supplies are delivered under existing civilian regulations, which seriously affects delivery times. And this happens all the time. For example, the European Court of Auditors, which conducted an audit commissioned by the Defense Alliance, found that just obtaining permission for military cargo to cross European borders currently takes 45 days. But this does not apply to ammunition, explosives, and fuel. Coordinating their transfer can take up to 80 days.
During the exercises, France tried to quickly deploy 2,400 troops and equipment to Romania. The mission faced repeated obstacles, customs checks, conflicting regulations, and delayed transit approvals. Now, officers warn that Europe's biggest problem is not human resources, but logistics.
Yes, bureaucracy is only part of the problem. There's more to it. The European Union Transport Commissioner warned that the mass transfer of troops from Western Europe to Eastern Europe could take weeks or even months, simply because of infrastructure problems, since some roads, bridges, crossings and tunnels in the Old World date back to the time of Queen Victoria, and they are simply not suited for moving ultra-heavy convoys with modern equipment. The European Union Defense Commissioner, who headed the commission tasked with auditing logistics routes for military transport, confirmed to his colleagues in Torre that investments of 70 billion euros are needed to compensate for the shortcomings of European military mobility, simply to once again modernize the transport infrastructure to meet today's challenges. You might think these funds were allocated right away, but they weren't. And not 70 and not billions, but only 1.7 billion, and even that by 2027. After all, the Commission identified a total of 500 infrastructure facilities that need reconstruction in order to allow for the unhindered transport of equipment from the west to NATO's eastern flank. These are bridges that can't handle heavy loads, tunnels that are too narrow and can't accommodate the size of modern military systems. These are roads designed for weights up to 40 tons, while most modern tanks weigh more than 55 tons. The Suwalki corridor is considered the most vulnerable point if Russia attacks European countries, but not because Russian forces from Africa could block it. It's actually difficult because dense forest covers both sides of the corridor. A different issue exists. Between Poland and the Baltic countries, there's no rail connection, well, except for one. In Lithuania, the Soviet standard gauge wider than the European standard begins. As a result, trains coming from Poland to the Baltic countries either have to transfer equipment onto platforms adapted to this gauge standard or change the bogies. As you can imagine, this process is interesting and fast. And the capacity of the Matskava railway station, where the trains are rebogied, is extremely limited. Simply put, it's a bottleneck where all the arms shipments will converge if by that time they manage to overcome all the aforementioned obstacles.
The latest combat readiness exercise DACIA Unfold 2025 revealed a harsh truth. Europe is not ready for rapid mobilization in the event of war. Outdated tunnels, fragile bridges, overloaded railways, and strict national regulations still slow the movement of armored columns by days or even weeks. For frontline countries like the Baltics or Romania, these delays could be catastrophic.
Brigadier General Fabrice Viola, commander of the French Operational and Transport Support Center, also noted the logistics issue among alliance countries in a report. In France, he noted, to support its battalion in Romania and supply Ukraine, it had to make 150 international railway trips in 2024. By the way, this gives us an idea of the scale of the logistical challenges. 150 trips to deliver a very small amount of military equipment to Ukraine. The list is on your screen, and that's for just one battalion of 1,000 people, 150 trips in a year. Just think about how many such trips would be needed to support a combined arms operation somewhere in Estonia. But most likely, some of you, my friends, will object, pointing out that we're talking about NATO, where the military doctrine relies more on air power, including in the field of logistics. Well, that's somewhat of a misconception. Both in the post-Soviet space and in the European part of NATO, the cornerstone of military logistics is the railway. But since we're talking about transport planes, the situation here is even worse than with European infrastructure and bureaucracy. All European NATO members combined have only 11 heavy transport aircraft C-17 Globemaster capable of lifting large cargo, such as tanks. By comparison, the United States has 222 of these giants. Any other European military transport aircraft in service, such as the medium Airbus A400M, can carry no more than 40. That's just one BMP, really. Europeans can quickly deploy infantry to the theater, but lack logistical support. Whether they would take such a step if Russia attacked, say, Estonia, I have serious doubts. But I have no doubt that Putin's electorate will be ready to follow the dictator's orders.
I also covered the war in Chechnya, and at that time met with the president of Chechnya, Dudayev, in February 1995. In an interview with me at the time, he said, "Marco, what's happening in Chechnya? This war will last another 50 years. If we are broken, then they will go to Georgia, to Crimea, to Ukraine, possibly to Poland, the Baltics, or deeper into Europe." I know as a Soviet general how deep this imperialist disease runs.
A logical question arises: why consider the logistical capabilities of European NATO members separately from the United States? I don't think this needs much explanation today. After reviewing the new United States national security strategy, in which Europe is essentially accused of prolonging the war in Ukraine, the leaders of the main democratic capitals should have serious doubts about whether the United States can be considered an unquestionably reliable ally in the event of a Russian invasion of one of the North Atlantic Alliance countries. Of course, it's impossible to know how the White House would respond to direct Kremlin aggression today. This is an equation with a large number of unknowns. However, that is precisely why it is more rational for Europe to proceed from the need to rely primarily on its own strength. I think this conclusion is clear.
He doesn't believe that the freedom and independence of Ukraine serves America's strategic interests. He doesn't understand what alliances are. I still fear that his dislike of NATO's assistance to Ukraine could result in Trump attempting to withdraw the United States from NATO. So there's a lot at stake.
Certainly, some politicians in the old world fully understand the threats looming over their countries. I'd be lying if I said none of the above problems are being addressed. For example, a year ago, during the third year of the war in Ukraine, Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland signed a declaration of intent to create a corridor that should solve infrastructure problems for the rapid transfer of military equipment. Once again, it's a declaration of intent, not a legally binding document. The parties have only noted their intent to revisit this issue later, but that's still positive. Plus, Berlin suddenly faced a severe shortage of basic railway platforms for equipment. There were 1,000 in 1990, but now only a few hundred remain. This year, they decided to buy the missing train cars. And of course, there are voices saying that maybe it's time to digitize the process of obtaining various permits when crossing the border. Because while Ukraine has long had the DIA app, which serves as the government in your phone, in Europe they still shuffle papers from folder to folder at the borders. But if you think I'm being ironic just to make fun of European politicians, you're mistaken. Actually, the problem isn't with them. In reality, the problem lies with the modern European electorate, which has become so accustomed to a comfortable life that they simply don't want to notice the looming threat. And the leaders of democratic countries have to navigate between the voters' desire to live as before and the need to prepare for war, and it really would be better to be prepared for it. Of course, I'm not excusing European politicians from responsibility. However, understanding that in the context of total disinformation from Russia and with the rise to power of outright populists in the United States, it is extremely difficult to convince European citizens that they are in fact already in a state of war. After all, Putin has not just encroached on the territory of Ukraine, he is aiming to break the established world order. And I understand how difficult it is to convey this to a society that for many years has been focused on individualism and the belief that the highest value is human life. To explain that, at a certain point, it must be ready not only to give up some social benefits, since their taxes should go to the military-industrial complex, but also be prepared to take up arms to defend Europe. But of course, the key problem is that today, Europe does not have a leader of such scale who could explain to the citizens of the old world why the unwillingness to fight for freedom always leads to much greater sacrifices. Yes, the second coming of Churchill never happened. A leader who could remind Europeans that the freedom they are used to living in was won through hard and bloody struggle, and that its preservation today is ensured by the fact that Ukrainian heroes are now taking the main blow upon themselves and that they have no other choice but to stand side by side with Ukraine. After all, otherwise it will all end badly.